Chapter 8 is the last chapter we're going to cover before we have our next exam. This chapter looks at the topic that the author refers as market failure versus government failure, but it includes several other things that I want you guys to pay attention to. For one thing, we're going to talk about what an externality is and show how externalities can influence the outcomes of a market. Then we're going to talk about three different ways of dealing with these externalities. After we leave that discussion, we're going to talk about public goods and what we mean by a public good. And then we'll transition into a couple of definitions that I want you guys to be familiar with that have to do with how information affects markets and the moral hazard that can arise if we do not have good information. And finally, we're going to talk about market failures and how government can and maybe shouldn't get involved in anytime we have a situation where a market fails. So let's start with the definition. Market failure, that's a situation in which the invisible hand acts in such a way that we're not getting socially desirable outcomes. Some of the reasons for that are, as we mentioned earlier, externalities. Another reason may be public goods that we're going to talk about a little bit later. And then finally, the fact that there may not be good information passing back and forth between buyers and sellers. A government failure is when the government tries to help, but actually makes the situation worse. So let's start with externalities. Externalities are the effects of a decision on someone not involved in the market, a third party, that the decision maker, the person or the company that makes these decisions, did not take into account. Negative externalities occur when the effects are detrimental. Positive externalities occur when the effects are beneficial. So let's start with negative externalities. That's the one you hear the most about, excuse me. We talk mostly about. So here, the marginal social cost of a event differs from the marginal private cost. And situations like that would be things like pollution, things that affect others that the entity that's creating the decisions, the externalities, does not take into consideration. Now, an example of a negative externality would look something like this. So here we've got a supply and demand that does not take into consideration the potential externality of what's being produced. So you see there a price of the good, and that would be P naught, and the quantity consumed of the good, Q naught. If the negative externality were taken into consideration, the cost to the provider would go up, which would shift the supply curve to the left. So the cost of that externality can be seen as the distance between the S naught, what we're calling marginal private cost, and S1, which we're calling marginal social cost. So anytime there is this negative externality, people are not paying as much as they should pay for the good in question, and we're consuming too much of it. So there may be an opportunity here for government intervention to reduce this externality, negative externality. And we'll talk about some ways that the government could go about doing that here in just a bit. Now, you also can have positive externalities. This is when all the benefits that come from the provision of this good or service is not being valued by the market. So it's the exact opposite of what we saw in the negative externality example. So let's do something here and look at how that may work. So here we've got our starting point where the marginal private cost is represented by the supply curve. The marginal private benefit is represented by the demand curve. And this is the price and the quantity that you would find if this positive externality was not being taken into consideration. So what if it was? What if the market fully valued the service or the product that's being produced? Then you'd have a demand curve that would shift upward from D0 to D1, meaning that the benefit of the externality that's not being taken into consideration by the market is shown by that distance between the two curves. That implies that the price of the service or good is not being fully valued. In other words, we're getting it too cheap, and that there's not enough consumption of the good. So here's another example where government intervention may be necessary, but this time, instead of decreasing supply, as we saw in the negative externality example, the government intervention may be necessary to increase consumption. Now, how could the government go about doing that? Well, for one thing, they could have what is referred to as direct regulation. They could simply pass some laws that directly limit the amount of a good that people are allowed to use, or they can use some tax incentive programs to try to offer a carrot to firms to not do the kinds of activities that are creating the negative externality. And finally, we've had some situations where we can look at market incentives. These are plans that require market participants to certify that they have done what we want them to do, and will be able to get some incentive within a market to help pay for it. And finally, we could simply ask people to voluntarily do the right thing. If you're producing something that is causing pollution, please don't do that anymore. Or if you're needing to get people to increase their consumption that benefits the whole community, asking them to do that voluntarily. Let's look at the tax incentive policy as an example of how we could go about reducing the negative externality. So here we've got a situation where you've got the marginal private cost represented by S0, marginal social cost represented by S1. We're currently paying the price P0. We should be paying the price P1. One thing the government could do is impose a tax on the producers that would shift their supply curve so that it mimics that marginal social cost, pushing us up to a point where you would see the price increase to P1 and you would see the quantity decrease down to Q1. Those taxes are often called effluent fees. You see them often used when you're talking about the problem of pollution. And we don't want these bad negative emissions coming out of power plants. Now let's think about a market incentive plan. How could you use a market to be able to incentivize people from doing the wrong thing? So it's a little different than direct regulation. We're not passing a law, but we are asking companies or telling companies that if they are going to do something like pollute through their plant, they have to get certificates that gives them permission to do that. Now those certificates, what the book calls marketable certificates, can be traded on a market, and the government can influence the supply of those certificates by reducing the number that are available, thus making the value of the marketable certificates that remain higher, which would encourage companies to reduce their pollution instead of buying these certificates or permission slips, if you will, to be able to continue operating as they currently do. And then finally, we can simply ask people to do the right thing. You know, asking these companies, we know that you are producing a product that generates pollution. Would you please, because you're a nice person or a nice company, will you please stop doing that? Well, as you can imagine, this creates a situation that the book refers to as the free rider problem. In other words, people are unwilling to do the right thing, hoping that somebody else will do it in their stead, and they are not going to be held accountable. That's the free rider problem. So we've got several policies here. We have direct regulation, we have tax incentives, we have voluntary reductions. What is the optimal policy? Well, the optimal policy is the one in which the marginal cost of undertaking that policy is equal to the marginal benefit. If we have a policy that's optimal, resources are not being wasted. Now, as an example, let's think about pollution. Is the right level of pollution zero? Well, not really. The right level of pollution is where the marginal benefit of reducing pollution equals the marginal cost for that outcome to come about. All right, let's change gears. Now we're going to talk about a public good. Public good is one that is used by the entire community. It's often provided by the public. It has to have two characteristics. First, it is non-exclusive, which means no one can be excluded from its benefits. And secondly, it's non-rival. Consumption of this good by one does not preclude consumption by others. Now, keep in mind, there's really no such thing as a pure public good. Here in our country, our national defense budget may be the closest example that we can identify. A private good, on the other hand, is only supplied to the individual who bought it. But a public good, once it's supplied to one individual, it is at the same time supplied to everybody. In the case of a public good, the social benefit of that good, that's the demand curve, is the sum of the individual benefits that each user of that public good would value the use of that good. Now, when we are thinking about creating a demand for the public good, we have to keep in mind we're going to go about this a little bit differently. For private goods, we sum the demand curves horizontally, but when we're doing it for a public good, we're going to sum those demand curves vertically. And we're going to show you an example of that here on the next slide. Okay, so here we've got three individuals that we're trying to see how they value a particular public good. Maybe for the sake of this example, think about visiting a national park, like going to the Grand Canyon. So we'd ask one individual, or we'd ask the individuals, or we've got three individuals, excuse me, I said that wrong. We've got two individuals, A and B. We'd ask the first individual, if you go to the Grand Canyon once, how would you value that? And they'd give you an answer. Then we asked them, well, if you went to the Grand Canyon 2 times, how would you value that? Now, like any other consumption good, their value of that as they increase more of it, or as they increase their consumption of it, goes down. So not surprisingly, they value the second visit a little bit less than they did the first. The same with the third visit. Now, our second individual must like going to the Grand Canyon more than the second individual. They have a higher demand curve. Now, when we want to see what is the market demand for visiting the Grand Canyon, you would simply sum up the values for 1 visit, for 2 visits, and then 3 visits. That gives you the market demand for this public good, visiting a national park. Now, as we think about the public good and its characteristics, remember its characteristics was it was non-exclusive and non-rival. We have here a chart that kind of illustrate that. So when you're trying to think of this concept, this chart may be helpful in helping you understand it. So let's look at degrees of excludability. 1 apple, you know, there's only 1 apple, so you can exclude anybody else from consuming that apple. If you think of a vast resource like fish in the ocean, excluding somebody from fishing the ocean would be impossible. Now, on the degree of rivalry, let's look at the same apple. If I'm consuming this apple, that means no one else is going to consume it. On the other end of that, think of something like a radio broadcast. Just because I'm listening to the radio does not mean other people can listen to the same radio broadcast that I'm listening to. Now we want to switch gears a little bit and talk about how information is so important to a market. Perfectly competitive markets assume that there is perfect information. Now, in the real world, there's not perfect information. And in fact, there's not even equal information. The buyers and the sellers will have different levels of information about the product or the service. But if that reaches a severe level, this information, this imperfect information, can be the cause of a market failure. Now that leads us to two new terms that I want you guys to learn. The first one is called adverse selection. So let's think about that information between buyers and sellers. Adverse selection is a problem that when the buyers and the sellers have different amounts of information about the good for sale. We're going to use an example in a little bit, and your end of chapter questions will expand on this, talking about selling a used car. Who knows more about the condition of that car, the buyer or the seller? Well, of course, the seller does. And so if the adverse selection problem is very bad, it's likely that the buyer of that used car, if it's not in good condition, will get ripped off, and so forth. A moral hazard problem occurs when people don't have to bear the consequences for their actions. Now, this really came into focus in the Great Recession that we had 10 years ago, because there were people that were doing things that caused the recession to occur, that helped cause the recession to occur with financial fraud and that sort of thing. And one of the criticisms that came in the aftermath was that very few people were held to account for their behavior during the lead up to the recession that caused that. So that would be moral hazard. Somebody does something wrong and they're not held accountable for it. How can you get around these informational problems? One way that we can get around is to somehow signal that the product I'm selling is indeed in the condition that I claim it is. And so by signaling that, it offsets that false signal of adverse selection. And here we come back to the selling of a used car. If there's something the seller can do to provide confidence to the buyer that the car is indeed in good condition, that would be a form of signaling. And this signaling can be done, for instance, in the offering of a warranty on the used car to make sure or to reassure the buyer that they're not buying a lemon. So how are some other ways that we can deal with informational problems? We can do some type of regulations to make sure that people provide the correct information and making it illegal for them not to do so. We can require providers to be licensed, and in the process of obtaining that license, they have to prove that they are actually good at what they're doing and the service that they are providing. Or we can allow markets to somehow get that information and help people obtain the information as they decide what they're going to buy or what they're not going to buy. So let's consider the medical profession when we're thinking about this informational problems. So here's an obvious service where there's a big difference between the buyers and the sellers. When you go to the doctor knows a whole lot more about what is wrong with you, what the potential treatments are, what the costs of those treatments are than you do. So you're at a disadvantage. And we have to have some way that we can make sure that the doctor is, first of all, competent, that knows what they're doing, that can actually discern what's wrong with you. And they have to get a medical license offered by the state to be able to prove that. But we could do some other things. I mean, we could have them post their grades from med school, for instance. How did you do in med school when you were studying this particular disease? What is your success rate? How have people done that? How have your patients fared afterwards? We could ask them to be very upfront and transparent in their charges and their fees. And that's what I think is going to be one of the big issues as we finally address the medical care, because there's so much of the fees are obscure to people. It's hard for us to see what in fact we're going to be paying. Or we could finally ask for references. Give me some names of people who are familiar with your work. Now, let's wrap up the chapter thinking about these government failures on top of market failures. All market failures will in some way fail. That does not necessarily mean that the government should get involved. The government should only get involved when their action could improve the market failure rather than making the situation worse. Now, what are some of the reasons that government intervention may fail? Well, here's 5 reasons that we can think about. First of all, the government doesn't really have an incentive to correct the problem. Secondly, the government may not have enough information to deal with the problem. Third, intervening in a market is always more complicated than it appears. Fourth, government is basically bureaucratic, and that natural bureaucracy means that it's difficult to fine-tune your intervention once you get started. And finally, government intervention almost always leads to more government intervention. That concludes the chapter on chapter 8. And want you guys to go back, look at these slides again. We'll discuss them in our Zoom class. And I want you to make sure you've read over the chapter, plus do the questions at the end of the chapter, and we will finish up with chapter 8. This will be the last chapter that we're going to have before our next exam. So our next exam will begin, we'll cover chapter 6, 7, and 8.